And we are back. What is up, everyone? I'm Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking. In the last video, we created a coin data service. It is a class that is solely focused on downloading coin data from the internet, and then we can put that coin data back into our view model. And that's great, but some of the code that we used in that data service is we actually want to be reusable. Because if we make another API call and we want to create another service class, we want to be able to reuse that code and not have to type it out again and again and again. So in this layer, we're going to create yet another class. It's going to be called the Networking Manager. And it's going to be a utility class that just contains some generic logic for downloading data from the internet. So this way, when we create our coin data service or another data service or another data service, we can reuse some of this code without having to retype it in every single service. And this is just another step when you are making these production apps to just make your code reusable and efficient. And I think by the end of this video, you're going to start to see why we are actually creating all of these different classes.
All right, welcome back everyone. I am back in our Xcode project. I think the last video was super exciting. I don't know if you guys got excited, but we finally got all of our coins onto the app, and we have some real data, and the app is starting to look like it's actually, you know, a real app now. But in this video, we're going to actually take a look at some of the logic that we added in the last video. So when I go to the coin data service, which is the file we made in the last video, we set up this function here, this getCoins function, to download from this URL. And in this function, we went to the URL, we subscribed on the background thread, we tried to map the URL response to see if it was valid or not. And then we received on the main thread, we decoded it into coin models, we handled the completion, and then of course we got the returned coins and we did something with it. And this is great, and this obviously works because the data is going into our app. But in this app and in other apps as well that you're going to make, you know, some of this logic you're going to repeat many times. So for example, this URL session.datataskPublisher, we could use this line of code for any URL, right? It doesn't have to be for this one. And the same thing for this subscribe. If we are downloading from a datataskPublisher, chances are every time we do that, we're going to want to subscribe on the background thread. We're always going to want to try to map it, try to map to data and make sure that it is a valid response. And then we're always going to want to receive on the main thread. So if theoretically we wanted to download from a different URL in our app, we would then have to recreate this entire function. So we would have to write this out again, as well as all of this code. And then it would work, but that's obviously not efficient. So what we're going to do in this video is make this bit of code reusable. So going to our project navigator on the left side here, I'm going to right click and create a new group. And I'm going to call this utilities. And in the utilities folder, I'm going to put all the files basically for kind of the same thing as services, except services are going to be third party and utilities will be more internal stuff. And again, I'm just setting this up this way. When you make your own apps, you can change your files and your folders. There is no technically right or wrong way to do it. But the important thing here is just make sure that your code is always nice and neat and your files are organized. How you want to organize it, that's up to you. But anyway, let's right click this utilities folder. Let's create a new file. It's going to be a Swift file, and let's call this Networking Manager. Go ahead and click create. This is going to be a class called Networking Manager. I'll open the brackets. And the first thing we're going to do in this Networking Manager is create a static func. I'm going to call this download, and we're going to pass in a URL of type URL, and we'll open the brackets. And I'm creating a static func because this function is going to be the same function always. So if we created just a regular func, we would then need to initialize an instance of the class in order to access this download. But by creating a static func, we never need to actually initialize this class. We can just call networking manager.download. So I'm going to open up a second editor here, and on the right side, I'm going to jump back into the coin data service. Okay. So what we're going to do is basically take some of this code and put it into here. So I'm going to copy I'm going to copy from this receive on all the way through to this URL session here. I'm going to copy it, and I'm just going to paste it in here. And we want to return this whole publisher from this function. So we need to return a publisher, and I don't know what type of publisher this is. So for now, I'm just going to say let temp equals. And then if I hold the option button and click on this temp variable, we can see the type that this publisher is. So we can see that it is of type publishers.receiveOn, publishers try map, publishers.data dispatch queue. So I could copy this type here. I'm going to move this over quickly because we're not using it for a second. And we can just paste in this type as the return type. And we just need to import combine at the top here. And now our function is working, but we need to return it. So instead of saying let temp equals, we'll just return this URL session. So the error should go away. And now we are returning this whole type here. And now this obviously is a working function, but to any, human, this is kind of ridiculous. Like what type this is, I don't even know. This is like some crazy publisher type thing. So one of the coolest things that we can do with Combine is actually call .erase to any publisher. And when we call erase to any publisher, it basically will take this publisher and convert it into an any publisher. So we get this error message here that it cannot convert any publisher data error to type, which is our received type. So I'm going to actually copy this any publisher and just paste that here. So because we're erasing it to any publisher, we are then converting the publisher into this very convenient any publisher. So a little confusing, but basically this is just like a nice return type that we can get from this download function. All right, so now that we have this download, it's going to do all of this logic for us. So I'm going to jump into the coin data service. And instead of calling all of this, we're going to delete this. I'm going to call networking manager.download, and we're going to pass in the URL. So you can see how we're cleaning up some of the code from this function already, because now this networking.download we can use throughout our app. We can use this anytime we have any URL, we can just call .download, and it's going to do all of this logic for us. Let's make sure this still works. So if I open up the home view and I resume the canvas, if I stop it and play it again, if I reload this canvas and it still downloads the data, we do know it's still working. Awesome. I'm going to jump back into this coin subscription, and handling this sync completion here, this is pretty generic as well. So I also want to take this bit of code and make it a function in our networking manager. So here, if I were to call .sync, I could see that this returns us a subscribers.completion with an error here. So I'm going to actually just press enter and then copy this type. And I'm going to delete this sync code. Let's jump into our networking manager. Let's create another function. Let's say static func handle completion. And in here, we're going to pass in that completion. And we'll say completion of type, and it will be subscribers completion error. Then we'll open the bracket. And now in here, we just want to do that same logic. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to copy this switch statement. I'm going to paste it in here. So same thing, this generic handle completion. And now that we have this generic function, we can reuse it a bunch of times in our app. So in our coin data service, I'm going to, instead of this sync, I'm going to call .sync. And where we have this first receive completion, I'm going to call networking manager Let's Command-Shift-K to clean and rebuild. Let's call it networking manager dot handle completion. And I can actually just delete this completion input here completely. And then in our received value, I will click enter. So this will be returned coins. Let's make it weak self. Let's just copy and paste that code. And I'm going to get rid of our original sync. I misspelled returned coins. And let's go back into the home view quick, make sure it is still working. To reload the home view. If we still see the data, we know it's still working, of course. And it is working. So now looking at our coin data service, we can see how much code we have saved from this file, right? Because the whole networking manager is now just this one line of code. And we did not include the decode in the networking manager because the decode is specific to this function, because this URL is returning us coin models. But if we go to another URL, it might return us some other type of model. So that's why we did not include this decode inside the download function. We just got this download function to go to the URL, return us data. So once we know we have data, we decode it, and then we can sync it. And we are syncing it. We are handling the completion generically in our networking manager. And then unique to this sync function is returning the actual coins. So I hope you guys are recognizing like why I'm going through all of this, because I know a lot of, especially beginner level courses, they don't walk you through these extra steps where you're like separating all your files and you're just creating these big massive files, but that's not actually very practical and realistic for like big production apps. If you ever start working on like very big apps and code bases, you're going to have so many files, and all of the files are going to have their own specific purpose, much like what we're doing here. Before we end this video, I'm going to jump into the networking manager and let's clean this up a little bit. All right, so the first thing I want to do here is actually just update this try map, because we are doing it here. But if we wanted to create like a second download that maybe use like a different publisher, we wouldn't want to repeat this bit of code as well. So what we're going to do is create a static func. We'll call it handle URL response. Open the parentheses, and the output here, if I hold the option button and click on the output, it is of type URL session.datataskpublisher.output. So I'm going to copy that, and we're going to pass in output here of type the URL session.output, and this call and this try map. If we hold the option button and click on try map, we can see that it throws and it returns of type T. And the type that we are returning is data. So here our function, we want it to also throws and return data. Open the brackets. I'm going to copy this guard statement here and just paste it into here. And then instead of this try map up here, we're just going to delete this and call .try map. And in here, I'm going to open the brackets and call handle URL response. And the output is going to be $0. And then we're going to get a quick error message that this call can throw, so we just need to mark it with try. So same thing that we were doing. So it's the same thing that we were doing, except this code is now much cleaner, obviously. And this URL response is now reusable if we wanted to create a second download function. All right, and the last thing I want to do is set up custom errors, because this error is great, but when you're actually building production apps, you're going to want to build your own specific errors for specific things in your app. This way you can really manage and figure out exactly where things are going wrong or something is crashing. So up here in this networking manager, let's create an enum and let's call it networking error. And let's make it conform to localized error and open the brackets. And I'm conforming to localized error because when we are printing out our error, we are printing out the localized description. So by conforming to localized error, we can give it customized localized descriptions. So we're going to have two errors that we're going to set up here. We're going to say case bad URL response and case unknown. And to customize the error message for each of these errors, we can just start typing error here and click enter. And we just need to give each of these an error description. So we will open the brackets. And then in here, so this is a variable that is inside of an enum. So basically we can switch on the current case of that enum. So we'll say switch on self. And this self is either going to be bad URL response or unknown. So we'll say dot bad URL response. And here, let's make it a blank string for a second. And then we'll say case dot unknown. And we'll make it a blank string for a second. And we don't need our default case here. And we are actually getting some error messages here because we need to actually return the string. And return the string. And return the string. And in this bad URL response, let's set the error message to bad response from URL. And for the unknown, we'll just say unknown error occurred. And let's actually add square brackets in here. And inside these square brackets, I'm going to press Control Command Space to open up the emoji keyboard. And if we get this, let's add maybe the flame. And then again in the unknown, I'm going to open and close square brackets. And in here, I'm going to add maybe the exclamation. I'm going to add maybe like the warning symbol. That might look cool. So I'm doing this just so that when it prints to the console, we can easily see, like with our eye, with the naked eye, that this is something that we had printed to the console personally. All right, so now that we have this error, we can just pass it in. So when we call handle URL response, instead of throwing this generic error from the system, let's instead throw a networking error dot bad URL response. All right, that should work. And then the last step here is I actually want to print out the URL response when we throw this. So in this return, I want to actually print out the URL that was bad. So on this case up here, I can actually add a parameter and it will be URL of type URL. So now our bad URL response is actually dot bad URL response with a URL. And here we will say let, and we'll call this variable URL as well. And now we can reference this URL in our string. So we'll backslash open close parentheses and we'll pass in the URL here. Let's make this a colon. So now we can actually print out this URL when we get this bad URL response, so we know exactly what the problem was. Finally, down here, we now need a reference to the URL, right? So we can call it .bad URL response, but we don't have a URL. So in this function here, we will also pass in a URL of type URL. Pass that into our bad URL response, and then finally we need to update our handle URL response with the URL, and we'll pass in the URL from here down to here. So a lot of moving parts now, but if we get this error, we should get this printout. So before we end this video, let's just check that it is working, because if it fails, we should print it out, right? Because we have the failure and then we're printing out the description. All right, and just to check that this printout is working, let's just force an error. So I'm just going to copy this throw, and let's just paste it at the top here so that it always throws. So let's just run this and build this to a simulator quickly. And hopefully when our simulator loads, it throws an error and we can see it. So our URL response is going to automatically throw an error. So I ran it on the simulator and we threw an error. And we can immediately see our flame emoji coming into the console, which we have right here. It says bad URL response, and then we get the printout of our URL. So we know our networking error is now working. And let's just end this video by taking out this force error here. And let's build to the simulator one more time and just make sure with all these updates, we are still downloading the data correctly. Awesome. The data is still pulling in and everything looks good. So again, that was a lot of setup, but this is going to come in really useful as we start downloading more things from the internet, because we can just use these handy download and handle URL response functions without having to write this code again. So in the next video, we're going to actually start downloading some of these images. And when we do that, we're going to actually reuse some of this code. So you'll realize pretty quickly why we did this. All right. Thank you guys for watching. As always, I'm Nick. This is SwiftUI Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.